I did a survey online, and I shared with people about 15 arguments against God from the friendly atheist, as he's known by, Hemant Mehta. He did a YouTube show where he gave 20 so-called arguments against God's existence. And this has over 260,000 views. And honestly, they're not very good. But I thought what I would do is read several of them and have you just respond. I promise.
Okay, I haven't heard these yet, so this is off the cuff.
Yes, you have. Don't worry. You've encountered these again and again and again. But what was interesting is I threw these up and I said to my followers, I want you to tell me what argument you find most difficult to respond to.
Yes.
And we had literally thousands of people write in. So again, don't worry, you're not on the hot seat here. So in fact, I shared this with somebody and said, these arguments aren't worthy to show Dr. Craig. And I thought, well, maybe they're not, but people are often moved by bad arguments.
They
so
are.
It's important that we address them.
Yes.
Okay. God is just Santa Claus for adults.
Well, I think that we have good arguments to show that God exists, and we have very powerful evidence that Santa Claus does not exist. There have been mappings of the North Pole and so forth. It's physically impossible for him to do what he's supposed to do on Christmas Eve, but we don't have comparably good arguments against God. So I think that the situation is not analogous.
Okay. Next objection. Who created God, and how does your answer to that make any sense?
My view is that God is a self-existent, uncreated, eternal being, and therefore cannot have a cause. And this is not something that's special pleading for God. The atheist has typically said this about the universe, that the universe is uncreated, eternal, and self-existent. But I think that's highly unlikely in light of modern cosmology. But it shows it's not special pleading for God.
What about when people say, they just say it? There's no evidence. Again, these are
What I
statements
say-
and
yeah,
questions.
right.
They're not really arguments.
Yes, what I say to that is that what you think? Well, I can think of at least 5 good arguments for God's existence. And at that point, he's got to say, yeah, like what? And then I'm off and running, and I share with him a number of arguments for God's existence. So it just completely pulls the rug from under the person who says there's no evidence for God's existence.
Something I've learned from apologist Trent Horn is to say to somebody, okay, what do you think is the least bad argument for God's existence? Obviously, you think they're all bad. What's the least bad? And very often, this kind of exposes, not always, because there are very thoughtful atheists, of course, but sometimes this will expose the atheist because they can't really give you the argument they think is the least bad.
Ah, yes, that is embarrassing, isn't it?
Okay, next one. Science explains so much of what we used to attribute to God.
Well, I would agree that we shouldn't postulate some sort of God of the gaps where we use God to plug up the holes in our scientific knowledge. But I think that we have very powerful scientific evidence for premises in philosophical arguments for the existence of God. For example, the second premise of the Kalam cosmological argument.
Why don't you lay the whole thing out for those who aren't aware?
That argument has 3 steps. 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. 2, the universe began to exist. 3, therefore the universe has a cause. Now, the second premise, the universe began to exist, is one to which scientific evidence is relevant. And contemporary cosmology provides, honestly, very, very powerful evidence in support of the truth of that second premise. So in this case, you've got a philosophical argument for God's existence that contains a premise which is powerfully supported by contemporary science. Another example would be the design argument based on the fine-tuning of the universe. And it also has 3 steps. 1, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. 2, it is not due to physical necessity or chance. 3, therefore it is due to design. And again, the second premise, that the fine-tuning is not due to physical necessity or chance, is powerfully supported by contemporary science. Richard Dawkins argues against physical necessity on scientific grounds.
So he has two options left.
Yes, and then Roger Penrose, a more formidable intellect than Dawkins, of Oxford University, argues against chance purely on the basis of scientific evidence. So there's very good scientific evidence for that second premise, and given that premise, then you have a philosophical argument for a cosmic designer of the universe. So that would be illustrative of the way in which contemporary science can be useful to the natural theologian who wants to argue for the existence of a creator and designer of the cosmos.
Right, and so these arguments aren't plugging up holes in our knowledge.
Not at all, as you can see.
Yeah.
On the contrary, I will often ask the atheist or agnostic, why do you refuse to follow the evidence where it leads? Why are you so resistant to the beginning of the universe when that's where the evidence points? That's a religiously neutral statement that can be found in any textbook on astronomy or astrophysics, and yet some people will just dig in their heels at that because I think they see where it's leading. And so it's not a matter of appealing to gaps in our knowledge. It's saying, please, why won't you follow the evidence where it points?
Which are you more convinced of, the argument from philosophy or astrophysics when it comes to the finitude of the world?
Wow. I suppose I like the philosophical arguments. I am a philosopher. Those really persuade me, whereas science is, of course, always provisional and capable of revision. And so what one has to say is that the scientific evidence that we have now provides very powerful support of the second premise. But these metaphysical arguments against the infinitude of the past just strike me as cogent, persuasive, and they've been around for 1,000 years or more.
And this is something I really hope Thomas Aquinas is wrong about. Because he has blistering words to say about the Kalam argument. His contemporary St. Bonaventure
exactly
proposed it, and but I hope he's wrong. And whenever I hear people articulate it, I mean, it seems cogent to me.
In defense of Aquinas.
Way to go. This is a way to appeal to our fan base.
Good.
Yes.
In defense of Aquinas, he does think that the Kalam cosmological argument offered by these Islamic theologians is a good probability argument. It does establish that there probably is a first cause of the origin of the universe. But because Aquinas' standard for success in natural theology is so high that it has to be a demonstration, he says we shouldn't use these probability arguments.
They make us look bad.
They are an embarrassment. He says before unbelievers we should restrict ourselves to strict demonstrations. Well, almost no natural theologian today holds to so high and unrealistic a standard in natural theology, and that would mean these probability arguments have a proper role to play in our natural theology.
I want to get you to give us the sort of philosophical argument for the finitude of the past, but I think it does say, again, a great deal about Thomas Aquinas, who people will often accuse him, you see, of being under the thumb of the church, but he rejected the most prominent argument in Christian history up until that point, Anselm's ontological argument. He rejects it.
Yeah,
and then
that's
he rejects
right,
the cosmology. So that is just to say that if he were simply under the thumb of the church, at the very least he wouldn't put them forward, but he thinks he refutes them.
It might be more accurate to say that the church is under the thumb of Thomas Aquinas, given the influence that he's had and his recognized place in the
Have you been
history of the
shocked
church.
at that as you've interacted with Catholics? You think, why are you also hung up on Thomas Aquinas?
Yes, I do think that because, I mean, I've read Aquinas. I studied him from the master's level on and read him, and it does seem to me odd that there is this sort of slavish devotion to this particular medieval thinker, but his being recognized by the church in the way
as the
that he
theologian,
has, yes, it gives him this very hallowed position.
Is there someone like that, would you say, in the evangelical world or history? I know there are lots of different kinds of Protestants, but is there?
Well, probably Augustine.
More in the kind of Calvinist-leaning community?
Yes, more so there, but really almost for all Protestants, they look back to Augustine with tremendous reverence and authority, I think.
But most certainly, neither Augustine or Aquinas is infallible, and so we should...
Oh, absolutely. And they would have insisted on that themselves.
Absolutely. Well, this is even what Aquinas says towards the end of his life, that if I've taught anything that's in contradiction to the church, reject it.
Hey, if you enjoyed that clip, you will absolutely love the full interview, so click right there to enjoy the whole thing. Also, a big thanks to these groups who made that interview possible. Learn more in the show notes below about these guys. They're absolutely incredible and honored to have them as sponsors. Oh, and also, if you haven't subscribed yet, click subscribe and then that bell button. That way YouTube will be forced to let you know when we put out more content.